Mary Tudor, the first woman to rule England, is remembered in history as Bloody Mary. But was this name a true reflection of reality, or was it a weapon of propaganda crafted by her enemies? Who was this woman who suffered so much before finally reaching the throne? Today, we revisit the life of one of England's most misunderstood queens. When people think of Mary Tudor, the image that often comes to mind is that of an unattractive woman with sadistic tendencies, an unsuccessful queen, and merely the sister of the great Elizabeth I. But what if I told you that Mary was not a monster? She was broken, betrayed by almost everyone around her, and deeply unhappy. She lived a life full of hardship, and had her fate turned out differently, England might have gained a great queen, no less than her sister. And I will prove this to you. But first, let us go back to February 18th, 1516, when Mary was born. In popular culture, Mary's birth is often depicted as a tragedy and a disappointment. But that is simply not true. As I've explained in one of my earlier videos, the birth of a girl in Tudor times was not automatically a disaster. Yes, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon desperately needed a male heir to secure the succession. But Mary's arrival was not a disappointment to them. It was a joy, a sign that they were capable of producing a healthy, living child after so many stillbirths. She was named Mary after Henry's favourite sister. By the way, Henry's famous remark, "We are both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God the sons will follow," was not said to Anne Boleyn about Elizabeth, as is often believed, but to the Venetian ambassador after Mary's birth. In childhood, Mary was deeply cherished by both her father and her mother. Henry, though a notoriously terrible husband, proved himself a loving new father. For one, he and Mary resembled each other physically. She inherited his trademark ruddy complexion and the reddish hue of his hair. He often proudly showed her off to foreign ambassadors, boasting that this child never cries and calling her the pearl of the world. Mary received an education worthy of a royal heir, hardly surprising, considering Catherine of Aragon. Catherine had witnessed firsthand the power of female rule in her own mother, Isabella of Castile, one of the greatest rulers of her age and a champion of women's education. Catherine personally oversaw Mary's upbringing, something highly unusual for queens at that time. She even consulted the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives, commissioning him to write a treatise on the education of girls. Just imagine how revolutionary this was for its time. Remember, Jane Seymour could barely sign her name, and Catherine Howard fared no better. Female education was a rarity. Yet in July 1520, at barely 4.5 years old, Mary entertained the French delegation by playing the virginals. By the age of 9, she could read and write in Latin. She studied French, Spanish, music, dance, and even Greek. Catherine shaped not only Mary's education, but also her religious convictions, instilling in her a deep devotion to the Catholic faith. This point is crucial to remember because Mary's later struggle to restore Catholicism in England would earn her the infamous nickname Bloody. But why did faith play such an immense role in the lives of these two women? As I mentioned earlier, Mary was the granddaughter of Isabella of Castile, who was honoured by the Pope himself with the title La Cattolica for her fight against the Moors and her unwavering devotion to the Church. And so, throughout her life, Mary would see herself as a defender of the true faith, carrying on the legacy of her great-grandmother. By 1525, the Tudor dynasty had already been on the throne for 40 years. Yet, by the 16th year of his reign, 34-year-old Henry VIII still had no male heir from his 40-year-old wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary, at that point, was the unofficial heir to the throne. Although some writings of the time referred to her as Princess of Wales, she never officially bore that title. Still, at the age of 9, she was briefly sent to the Welsh border, to Ludlow Castle, the same place where Prince Arthur, once heir to the throne, had been sent. It was done to emphasise her importance. At the very same time, however, Henry elevated his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, granting him the titles of Duke of Richmond and Somerset. He even received lands that had once belonged to Margaret Beaufort herself. This shows just how highly Henry valued his illegitimate son. For Catherine and Mary, this was a deep humiliation. Mary may not have fully understood the weight of it at only 9 years old, but likely just As Henry's love for Catherine faded, so too did his affection for his daughter. And did you know? At one point, Henry even considered marrying his son and daughter to each other in order to strengthen their claims to the throne. Yes, take a moment to process that. Even the Habsburgs would envy such an idea. This came during the time of his divorce proceedings, and the Catholic Church was even willing to grant special dispensation for such a marriage, simply to prevent Henry from breaking with Rome. Mary's world truly collapsed when her father began moving to annul his marriage to her mother. She became a pawn in a brutal conflict. Henry claimed that his marriage had never been lawful in the eyes of God, since he had married his brother's widow. But of course, we all know Henry's heart was set on a new woman, Anne Boleyn. The first crushing blow for Mary was when Henry separated her from her mother, forbidding them to see one another. Catherine was banished from court in 1531. Around this time, under the stress, Mary began to suffer serious health problems, issues which would later foreshadow the grave illnesses of her final years. Most likely they were connected to gynecological health. She experienced nausea and painful menstrual cycles. Another devastating blow for Mary, as a devout Catholic, was her father's break with Rome. For years, she refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the new Anglican Church, and only did so much later, almost out of fear for her own life. By 1533, Henry had successfully divorced Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. As a result, Mary lost her title of princess and was reduced to the lesser title of the Lady Mary. Her servants were dismissed and her household was dissolved. Thus, the girl once adored by her father, a princess raised in comfort and care, suddenly became an illegitimate daughter, excluded from the line of succession. Her relationship with her father grew so strained that they did not speak for 3 years. Anne Boleyn, despite my generally positive view of her, treated Mary extremely harshly, becoming very much the nightmare stepmother. Not only was Mary forced to serve as nursemaid to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, but Anne also instructed Elizabeth's governess, Lady Shelton, that she could strike Mary like the cursed bastard she is. It is hardly surprising that Mary resented her situation. When first placed in Elizabeth's household at Hatfield, she was openly defiant, spending days locked in her chamber, weeping uncontrollably, and refusing to acknowledge Elizabeth as princess. She did, however, call Elizabeth sister, just as she had always called Henry Fitzroy brother. All the while, Mary's health was deteriorating. One of her physicians observed that her illness stemmed directly from the mistreatment she endured. In September 1534, mother and daughter were likely allowed to see one another for the last time. A letter from the Spanish ambassador Chapuis, dated September 27, records, "The Princess Mary has been very ill. The king, her father, sent her his physician and permitted the queen also to visit her. After that, until Catherine's death, they were forbidden from meeting again, and even from corresponding, though, thanks to sympathetic friends, they still managed to exchange letters in secret. In one of these letters, Catherine wrote to her daughter, 'Answer with few words, obeying the king, your father, in everything, save only that you will not offend God and lose your own soul, and go no further with learning and disputation in the matter. And wheresoever, and in whatsoever company you shall come, observe the king's commandments.' Catherine believed in a bright future for her daughter, and in the same letter she added, 'For I dare make sure that you shall see a very good end, and better than you can desire.' She died on January 7, 1536, at only 50 years old. Mary was described as inconsolable. Her father did not allow her to attend her mother's funeral. Anne Boleyn, who outlived her rival Catherine by only 5 months, the day before her execution, called for Lady Kingstone, wife of the Constable of the Tower, and asked her to relay her message of repentance to Mary. According to Martin Haley, Anne knelt before Lady Kingston and requested that she throw herself in like manner at the feet of Lady Mary and beseech her to forgive the many wrongs which the pride of a thoughtless, unfortunate woman had brought upon her. In his book, Elizabeth, David Starkey writes that after Anne Boleyn's execution, Mary made her peace with Boleyn's ghost and prayed that that woman might be forgiven. With the help of Henry's new wife, Jane Seymour, and under pressure from members of the King's Council, who even threatened to strike her head against the wall until he made it as soft as a boiled apple, Mary signed a document effectively acknowledging her illegitimacy. she signed an oath of submission. In one of her letters to Jane, Mary thanked the Queen Consort for her motherly joy, offered to serve her obediently, and signed off as "Your Grace's most humble and obedient daughter and handmaid." The two women developed a kind relationship, as both were devoted Catholics, and Jane, who had once served Catherine of Aragon, held deep sympathy for Mary. Mary even became godmother to her little brother, Edward. Sadly, she also served as chief mourner and rode in Jane's funeral procession only 12 days later. Ahead of her still lay 3 more stepmothers. By this time, Mary was already considered long overdue for marriage by the standards of her age, a stark contrast to her great-grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, who had 3 marriages behind her by the age of 15. Yet, all the marriage alliances planned for Mary since she was only 2 years old had come to nothing. However, in December 1539, a potential suitor finally appeared on the horizon: Philip, Duke of Bavaria. According to the French ambassador Marillac, Philip did not speak English, so the two communicated in a mixture of Latin and through a German interpreter. During his visit, he even kissed Mary, something Marillac noted no lord of this kingdom had ever dared. After this meeting, an item appeared in the inventory of Mary's possessions: a cross of diamonds, set with 4 pearls and 1 great pearl pendant at the same, given by Duke Philip. Yet, since Philip was a relative of Anne of Cleves, in fact her cousin, Henry refused to grant permission for the marriage. It's almost ironic. Henry had no problem with the idea of marrying half-siblings to each other, yet suddenly a third cousin of a wife whose marriage was later annulled and never consummated seemed entirely inappropriate. Of course, religious differences also stood in the way of the match. But personally, I think if this marriage had gone through, it might have been a happy one. Mary was only 23 at the time, and she might have had children of her own. But that remains just another what if. Philip left England after a month, though he returned 3 more times, meeting Mary only once again. Mary's relationship with her new stepmother, Catherine Howard, who was younger than Mary herself, was tense. Records show that in December 1540, Catherine asked Henry to remove 2 of Mary's closest attendants because Mary was not showing her the respect she expected. Perhaps this explains why, when Catherine was later executed for adultery, Mary assumed the unofficial role of mistress of the court and was invited by her father to join the royal Christmas festivities. One of the most significant influences in the lives of Henry's children came from Catherine Parr. In my video about her, I described her as nothing less than a true kingmaker. Several letters survive between Catherine, Elizabeth, and Edward, where Elizabeth refers to herself as "your most obedient daughter," and Edward writes of being Catherine's loving son. In only one letter, dated 9th of August 1548, Mary herself signs as "Your Highness's humble and assured loving daughter." This suggests that Mary and Catherine likely shared mutual affection, perhaps even a sisterly bond. Ambassador Eustace Chapuis reported that Catherine favours the princess all she can, noting how the 2 women were almost always together. Catherine was certainly a driving force in helping to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. Since we've touched on the topic of Mary's siblings, let's pause here and look at it in more detail. What were the relationships like between Henry's 3 children? As I mentioned earlier, Mary called Elizabeth her sister. In fact, they were very close when Elizabeth was a child. This was largely because Mary, who was 17 years older than her half-sister, took pity on Elizabeth after Anne Boleyn's execution. Most likely, Mary felt for her a mix of sisterly and almost maternal affection. But as Elizabeth grew older and increasingly resembled her mother, their relationship became more complicated. Still, Elizabeth would stand by her sister during Mary's struggle for the throne, and would even ride into London alongside her in triumph. Yet later, once Mary became queen and married, their bond grew extremely tense. And as you surely remember, who was it that sent Elizabeth to the Tower? The greatest irony of fate is that even in eternity, the 2 sisters remained together. King James I, Elizabeth's successor, decided to have them buried one above the other. The inscription at Westminster Abbey reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of the resurrection." As for her brother Edward, Mary, being 21 years older than him, treated him with genuine, almost maternal care. we should also recall the role that Jane Seymour played in Mary's life, which perhaps strengthened this affection toward her half-brother. She showered Edward with gifts as she did with Elizabeth, sometimes even hand-making them herself. Shirts, for example. Edward took special delight in Mary's company, though he disapproved of her fondness for foreign dances. "I love you most of all," he wrote to her in 1546. Nevertheless, when Edward ascended the throne in 1547 after Henry VIII's death, Mary preferred to remain at her estates and seldom visited court. The country was effectively ruled by a regency council composed of Protestants, while Mary openly defied them by ordering Catholic Mass to be celebrated in her household. When she was invited to court for Christmas in 1550, a fierce family quarrel broke out over religion. Edward publicly rebuked Mary before the entire court for ignoring his laws on worship, reducing her to tears. At one point, she even considered fleeing England for Spain, and ships were reportedly waiting for her in Essex. But in the end, she changed her mind and then stayed. Sensing his own death approaching at just 15 years old, Edward was determined that the throne should not pass to his elder sister, the Catholic Mary. But he also hurried to exclude Elizabeth, despite the fact that she shared his Protestant faith. Instead, he passed the crown by his devise for the succession to Lady Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary. I don't know exactly what Mary thought of this decision, but to me it must have felt like yet another betrayal by a man in her life. Just as her father had once betrayed her, now her own brother was doing the same. But Mary was not about to give in. She would fight for what was hers by right. When Mary learned of the plot against her, that under the pretext of visiting her sick brother, they planned to lure her to London and arrest her after his death, she fled to East Anglia, where she knew she had strong support. There she boldly proclaimed herself queen and wrote to the Privy Council, declaring that she was the rightful monarch and that they must acknowledge her. Poor Lady Jane Grey, little more than a teenager caught in the hands of political schemers, had also been proclaimed queen and awaited her coronation in the Tower. But Mary's support grew rapidly. She gathered an army of nearly 20,000 supporters, and the Privy Council suddenly switched sides. On the 19th of July 1553, they declared Mary the true queen, deposing Jane, who remained in the Tower, but now as a prisoner. On the 3rd of August 1553, Mary triumphantly entered London on a wave of popular support, accompanied by her half-sister Elizabeth, and a grand procession of over 800 nobles and gentlemen. The streets erupted in celebration, bells rang across the kingdom, and on the 1st of October 1553, Mary was crowned as the first officially recognised ruling Queen of England and Ireland. She was not to be underestimated. She had proven herself decisive, courageous, and politically shrewd, securing the throne with the backing of both Catholics and Protestants, uniting the nation under her rule. But reaching the long-awaited throne was only half the battle. Holding on to it, and onto the people's love, was another matter entirely. And here, unfortunately, Mary began to make mistake after mistake, each one costing her popularity in the eyes of her subjects. The first serious blow to Mary's reign was the execution of Lady Jane Grey. Despite the popular image of Mary as a cruel, bloodthirsty queen, she was actually reluctant to put Jane to death, understanding that the young girl had been nothing more than a pawn in the hands of ambitious men. But when a rebellion broke out just 4 months after Mary had taken the throne, aimed at restoring Jane and even backed by her own father, Jane's fate was sealed. From that moment, Protestants began to see Jane as a martyr, and the atmosphere in the country grew increasingly tense. The rebellion, in fact, was also fueled by Mary's marriage plans. At 37, the unmarried queen quickly set about arranging a union with Philip of Spain. Many at court objected, arguing that marrying a foreign prince risked placing English affairs under foreign influence, but Mary longed for an alliance with Spain, envisioning a powerful Catholic union. It is very likely she saw herself as the heir to the mission of her grandparents, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, restoring Catholicism, this time to England. At their first meeting, Mary was clearly smitten and enchanted by Philip. Philip, however, found little to admire in his bride, who was 10 years his senior. Sadly, Mary's long-standing health problems, particularly gynecological ones, had taken a toll on her appearance. One of Philip's confidants remarked that she was a very good creature, though rather older than we had been told, and added that if she were to adopt Spanish fashions, she would not look so old and flabby. Another description that survives is even harsher. The Queen is not at all beautiful. She is small, with a white complexion, and has no eyebrows. She is a perfect saint and dresses badly. Nevertheless, Philip treated his future wife with courtesy and gallantry, and the two were married on 25th of July 1554, just 2 days after their first meeting. Mary desperately longed for a child. This was both her personal desire and her mission as Queen, to give England a Catholic heir. At the same time, her relationship with her sister Elizabeth grew strained, as Mary suspected her of involvement in plots, and even confined her in the Tower for 2 months. All the more reason why an heir seemed urgently necessary. In September 1554, it seemed that her prayers had been answered. Mary began to gain weight and showed all the signs of pregnancy: nausea, missed periods, and swelling. Her doctors and courtiers rejoiced. But as the expected due date came and went, no child appeared. It became clear that Mary was suffering from a false pregnancy, a rare condition sometimes caused by hormonal imbalance, but often rooted in psychological factors, especially the overwhelming desire to conceive. Soon after the humiliation of her phantom pregnancy, Philip left England to command his armies in Flanders against France, and as gossip travelled across Europe, it was whispered that Philip's bed was far from empty during his absence. This part of Mary's life truly breaks my heart. She had already endured so many losses and betrayals, and this tragedy must have shattered her completely. She fell into a deep depression, betrayed now by the third most important man in her life, her husband. It's unclear to what extent Mary's emotional state influenced what came next, but this year marked the beginning of the mass burnings of Protestants. In total, Mary is credited with the execution of around 280 people. Of course, that number does not compare with the 58,000 to 72,000 executions attributed to her father, Henry VIII. But because of the sheer horror of burning victims alive, it was Mary who would forever be branded with the name Bloody Mary. Mary's depression soon gave way to physical illness and weakness, likely caused by uterine cancer. In 1557, after her husband briefly returned to England to persuade her into joining a war against France, a war that ended in disaster with the loss of Calais, she endured yet another heartbreaking false pregnancy. By then, it became clear she would never have children. Sensing death drawing near, Mary formally acknowledged Elizabeth as her heir on the 6th of November, 1558. Just 11 days later, on the 17th of November, the first crowned Queen of England died at the age of 42. Her end was a tragic one: lonely, abandoned, without the loving husband or children she had so desperately longed for all her life. With the accession of her sister, Mary's image quickly became buried under layers of myth. Yet she was neither the vengeful, cruel woman of legend, nor the pathetic, love-struck wife who should have taken the veil. She was stubborn, uncompromising, certainly not without flaws. Above all, she was a product of her time. Despite failures in her private life and in war, Mary's reign was not without merit. She reformed the coinage, increased royal revenues, founded new hospitals, improved the education of the clergy, and strengthened local government. Many of the reforms later celebrated as hallmarks of Elizabeth's reign had actually begun under Mary. But with only 5 short years on the throne, she simply did not live long enough to see the fruits of her efforts. Perhaps the difficulty in judging Mary lies in the fact that, like her brother Edward, her reign was so brief, wedged between 2 giants of history, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But one thing is clear: she changed the rules of the game forever and paved the way for her sister, ushering in what would become England's golden age. So, what do you think about Mary's fate? If you knew her dramatic story, what nickname would you give her? Personally, I would call her not Bloody, but Broken Mary. Share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.